Hi there, it's Dr. Bernstein, and by now you should have watched the documentary on realism. And as you know, the makers of the documentary bring up so many different issues related to realism and naturalism. And I thought it would be helpful to provide you with a really condensed definition of these movements, tell you a little bit about when this movement was taking place in America, and then give you some background information on Stephen Crane, who is associated with both the realist and naturalist movements. So, the most important thing to know is that they're realists, and this is a semi quote, the realists emphasize the importance of creating faithful representations of concrete reality. So they were really trying to focus on how things actually are or were. And they focused, rather than focusing on how they wish things would be or how they hope things would be, they focus on the way things actually are. And as you know from the documentary, they tended to focus on the present rather than on the past or the future. Another important thing to know is that with the realists, there was this movement away from elevated characters, themes, and language, and a movement towards ordinary characters in doing their day-to-day things. So it's more focused on the ordinary, the common. Now, the naturalists are part of the realist movement, but the naturalists tended to emphasize the degree to which their characters are controlled by their environment and heredity. And I will give you some examples of this in Crane's writing to help illuminate these definitions. So, the realist movement in American literature began in 1865, so basically towards the end of the Civil War, and it drew to a close by around 1900. Now, as I said before, Crane fit within both these movements. So Crane, he was born in 1871 and he died in 1900. So he was very young when he died. He was very prolific. By the time he died of tuberculosis at the age of 28, he had published 6 novels, more than 100 stories, 2 books of poetry, and many, many newspaper articles. Now, his first novel was published in 1893, and it was called Maggie, a Girl of the Streets. And this is a story that focuses on this young girl who grew up in the slums of New York and who eventually turned to prostitution and committed suicide. It's a very, very optimistic story, as you can tell. I'm being sarcastic. Now, this work, it tends to be associated with the naturalist movement because it shows how Maggie's environment, the slums of New York, and her heredity, like where she came from, her family, were determining forces in her life that sort of closed off options and forced her into other situations. So she doesn't really have as much control over her life as she would think. Now, Crane in this story, it was really known. He really got a reputation for using very graphic, gritty language that he overheard on the streets. And some of the most well-known realists actually warned him and said, "Hey, listen, you should really take some of this profanity, some of these curses, some of this sort of low language." And get rid of it because it's going to upset people. So the very people who were associated with creating concrete, faithful representations of reality were telling him that he was being a little too real. And Crane resisted, and instead, publishers rejected him, and he wound up self-publishing the book using a pseudonym. And he paid people the rumors that he paid men to sit on the subways and read his book so that everybody would see, like, oh, what's this book? I noticed, like, all these people are reading these books. So it didn't really work, but I think it was an interesting tactic. And it was 2 years later, in 1895, that he really became he was catapulted into literary fame when his book A Red Badge of Courage, another novel or novella, was published. And this is a book that a lot of you may have read in high school. It focuses on a young boy who's about to go onto the battlefield for the first time in his life. And this book is really associated with the realist movement. And um, so the character is this young boy who'd been filled with all these heroic ideals about the glory of war and uh, the heroism that can come from being involved in it. And so here's this character from this older sort of mindset, and he gets into this realist world where that's stripped of this idealism, and he has this really hard time um, getting himself onto the battlefield. And people couldn't believe that at this time, Crane himself did not have any experience on the battlefield. But he just had this ability to really get into the mind of his character and show us this psychological realism of all the things that were going through his character's mind. And Crane himself had been fascinated by the photography associated with the Civil War. And here's, photography really is supposed to show you the way things truly are. But he was noticing that there's something that photography didn't include, and that is all the thoughts and feelings that the people were experiencing. So you get in his book these descriptions that are almost like photographic. And then you also get this realism about what's going through this character's mind. And it was really just shortly after the publication of Red Badge of Courage, 1897, that Crane went aboard a steamer, and that wound up sinking. So and then he wrote a newspaper article about his experience, and then a few months later he wrote The Open Boat. So The Open Boat is based in part on a real life situation that he experienced. So one thing you might want to think about when you're reading his story is, why would he want to tell this part of his experience in a short story? Like, what will a short story allow him to do that maybe a newspaper article or a work of fiction would not allow him to do? And when you're reading, you can think about the extent to which The Open Boat is a work of realism and or a work of naturalism. This is a question that we can explore on our discussion boards. And then, so that's about wraps up the introduction here, but later on next week, you'll get a video or a presentation on point of view and theme, which are two big things that you need to be thinking about now that we're reading short stories and then moving on to plays. So that's it for now. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Bye.